Hi, my name is Sue Monahan, and I'm the CEO of the Small Cell Forum. I'd like to warmly welcome you to our session on neutral hosts, regulation, and best practice. More progressive regulation is absolutely critical to our mission of proliferating the deployment of small cells globally. The ecosystem has become much more diverse, and therefore it is imperative that regulation evolves with it, because the ecosystem is no longer just comprised of mobile network operators and a handful of large vendors. It is much more diverse today, and that's a good thing because diversity drives innovation and market growth. When we talk about a diverse ecosystem, we are talking about the market applications, diversity in types of deployers, and diversity of technology supply chains, and Open RAN. We are seeing the ecosystem diversify across the use cases, the form factors, vendors, and deployers of small cell networks. So I will briefly summarize how Small Cell Forum is addressing these areas to avoid market fragmentation globally. Let's look at diversity in the market applications. These comprise a vast array of vertical markets from ports and logistics to healthcare, enterprise and commercial property, automotive and transportation, and Industry 4.0 in manufacturing. Then we look at diversity in the technology supply chain and Open RAN. This requires interchangeability of parts at the component level, interoperability, disaggregation, virtualization, and productization. Small Cell Forum is doing work in each of these areas in support of supply chain diversification and Open RAN. And finally, we look at diversity of service providers, ranging from mobile network operators to neutral host providers to private network operators. And while traditional mobile operators will continue to provide national or global public network connectivity, some of these new market applications cannot be addressed by those networks. Neutral hosts provide multi-operator networks that can open up affordable indoor coverage. And the private network operators are providing custom networks for specific organizational needs. So the ecosystem has evolved from the single operator network model, which means that regulators need to understand how progressive regulation can support the digital transformation that is part of essentially every national infrastructure agenda, such as the huge investments planned in the US. Small Cell Forum has published several documents in support of these new service models. They are listed across the bottom of the slide and may be downloaded from our website, smallcellforum.org. Here's a projection for enterprise small cell deployments by deployer type. On the far right, you see the extensive list of diverse service providers who will be deploying these enterprise networks. The best case outcome for scale and growth is highly dependent on regulation that supports the commercial and operational priorities of a significantly more diverse service provider market. To be clear, SCF is not about supporting the regulatory needs of one group over another. We're about supporting and lobbying for regulation that drives the growth of low-cost, flexible mobile infrastructure and reflects the new diverse ecosystem of service providers. We have a great track record of helping to bring about change, and we've collaborated with other organizations such as 5G Americas to promote a light touch regulation in the US via the FCC. And we've worked with the European Commission on European Electronic Communications Code, once again to support a light touch deployment regime for small cells in 5G rollout. So looking ahead, we aim to provide a unified message to regulators and other authorities to ensure neutral host provider requirements are understood in addition to those of the mobile network operators. We also aim to reduce deployment timelines through dissemination of global practice, use case requirements, as well as blueprints. And we will deliver lobbying materials for global markets and specific regions, for instance, to explain the socioeconomic benefits of alternative service provider models. And finally, we aim to ensure that regulators who are defining the evolving connectivity models for things like spectrum, network sharing, and network ownership, that they fully consider alternative service providers when forming policy. Many of the priorities that Small Cell Forum aims to address are reflected in the rest of this session, along with some great examples of the socioeconomic impact for nations and citizens, given a best practice approach. We've brought together some of the world's leading regulatory experts to share best practice from their respective regions. The aim is to provide an overview of what comprises progressive regulation for deployment, spectrum, network sharing, and coverage, and to assess what needs to improve to meet the commercial needs of service providers and to realize the ambitions of policymakers. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Chris Woolford, Director of International Spectrum Policy at Ofcom. Chris?
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending upon where and when you're listening to this recording from. My name is Chris Woolford. I'm the Director of International Spectrum Policy at Ofcom in the UK, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in spectrum. Firstly, I was asked to sort of give some thought to things that have gone well. And starting with the European perspective, I think one thing that we have done well is to provide clarity and stability around the framework for 5G in Europe. Back in 2016, the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, which is a European group, identified 3 pioneer bands for 5G, that being the 700 megahertz band, the 3438 gigahertz band, and the 26 gigahertz band. And that has really formed the basis for 5G deployments across Europe over the next few years, particularly in the 34 to 38 band. And I think it was a lot to be said for that clarity of message, that stability that framework provided, and indeed the simplicity of the message as well, which has provided the basis and the stability that's enabled the mobile network operators to actually roll out. And indeed in the UK now, we see all 4 mobile network operators rolling out their 5G networks, and that's something that's being replicated across European countries. Something else that I think we've done well in the UK is around our spectrum sharing framework. We've made 4 bands in the UK available on a shared basis as part of that sharing framework. And the aim really there is to make spectrum available at a more localized level, making spectrum available when and where it's needed. And that is, I mean, we've always made spectrum available in places at a localized level, but a lot of the focus has been on national licenses. And I think we're now beginning to sort of think about how we can actually make that available at a more disaggregated level, really getting it to the users of the spectrum when and where they need it. So we've developed a couple of relatively low power license products, one being a small area localized sort of 50-meter radius type license, which enables users to deploy within that 50-meter radius. The other being a slightly higher slightly higher power single base station license, still sort of medium power type application. And like I say, it's about getting the spectrum out to people that want to use it in a way which is relatively easy for them to access, and indeed relatively cheap for them to do so, in terms of sort of license fees and things like that. We've seen a lot of interest in particular in the 38 to 42 gigahertz band, which we've made available on a shared basis. Lots of interest from industry verticals, and that's really sort of driving some innovative use cases around private networks and those sort of industry vertical type applications, and people that may not have used spectrum before. And we think this is therefore a really good solution, taking advantage of the ecosystems, the equipment ecosystems that have developed in relation to the 38 to 42 band, particularly thinking about use in the US, where they've made 38 to 42 or making that available for mobile mobile operators. So the equipment is being developed, and it's enabling sort of some innovative use cases. We're also aware that this is now being looked at a European level, and we anticipate that CPT over the next sort of 12 months or so will be beginning to look at this 3.8 to 4.2 band again, which will help to develop the ecosystem. So I think that's an example of sort of the innovative type applications and innovative ways of making spectrum available, which is helping to drive some of the sort of the economic and social developments, which will ultimately bring benefits to consumers. In terms of things that we need to do better or where we can improve, that was the other area I was asked to talk about. And as with many things, there's always two sides to a coin. So I think the first thing, I've just spoken about spectrum sharing, and as one of the good things, I think that an area that we need to improve on is also around spectrum sharing. I mean, we have done, as I've just said, some good work in relation to 3.8 to 4.2, and the framework that exists there in the UK. But I think we need to do a lot more, in particular to try and make spectrum sharing work. All too often, I think we're good at putting up obstacles, which actually make spectrum sharing more difficult. Spectrum sharing is one of those interesting things. If you talk at a conference about spectrum sharing, sort of everyone agrees with you. I mean, you can talk on a platform and generally you'll get sort of various nodding heads and murmuring noises of sort of assent. And everyone tends to agree that spectrum sharing is a good thing to promote more efficient use of spectrum. But then when you start talking about specific bands, it generally becomes much more problematic. Often we find that people are putting up obstacles to actually making sharing work in a particular band because they perceive that might put at risk their use in that band or in an adjacent band. And I think that's something we really need to address. We need to find a way of changing the mindset. And that's changing the mindset of everyone, really. It's not just about spectrum users, it's about spectrum regulators, spectrum management, governments, everyone involved in spectrum. We need to try and think differently about how we can manage spectrum in order to make spectrum work. And that change of spectrum, that change of mindset is really around getting away from this sort of, how can I protect my bit of spectrum? How can I put walls around it to protect what I've got? To instead get people to think about, how can I provide the services that I want to provide? Absolutely, we want to ensure that people can continue to do that. But equally, how can I also think about doing that while also sharing my spectrum, also enabling others to use the spectrum, while, as I say, ensuring that I can still provide the services that I want to provide? And I think that's a challenge that we've got to get better at. And perhaps I could conclude really with two further points, which I think sort of extend on from that, two other areas where I think we need to get better. Firstly, I think as regulators and spectrum managers, we need to better understand the needs of spectrum users, particularly the innovators, some of those people that we haven't dealt with so much in the past, people we don't necessarily think about as traditional spectrum users, but might be driving some of the innovation of the future. And similarly, I think users of spectrum, everyone out there, actually, and particularly businesses and people that may not have thought so much about spectrum so much in the past, really do need to think about their connectivity solutions and where wireless connectivity may play a part. And at the moment, I think there's still a gap between the spectrum managers that make spectrum available and the spectrum users, and the way in which both sides think. We need to try and bring that closer together and actually really sort of enable those different parties to communicate, to collaborate, and think about what sort of connectivity solutions may be best. And then secondly and finally, I think we can do more to ensure that the spectrum frameworks, and that's the frameworks at both domestic and international level, are appropriate. I've spoken about spectrum sharing, and if you look at the spectrum frameworks that we've got in place at the moment, many of those were developed many years, often many decades ago, when the environment was very, very different. We tended to be looking at much lower frequency spectrum, national licenses, spectrum that traveled over national borders for long distances because of the propagation characteristics. Things have moved on a lot since then, an awful lot. If you think of the spectrum that we're actually using and putting out into the market today. And I think those frameworks really need to catch up and think about how things like spectrum sharing can actually be made to work, particularly in some of the frequency bands that we're using today. And in particular, as spectrum managers, we need to ensure that we're not always going back to the solutions of the past to try and solve some of the problems of the future, because I do think to solve some of the problems of the future, we're going to need some more innovative solutions, particularly in terms of how we make spectrum available. I hope that's been of interest. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good afternoon, morning, or evening. Thank you very much.
Hello, welcome to this seminar on the regulatory frameworks that surround the investment in independent or neutral host wireless infrastructure. My name is Alistair Davidson, and I'm Director of Strategy and Regulation at Wireless Infrastructure Group, often known as WIG. We're an independent operator, and we've been investing in wholesale infrastructure in the UK and Europe for over a decade. We help to improve mobile connectivity and other wireless connectivity in challenging areas, whether that's in sparse rural areas or whether that's in high footfall buildings and on city streets on the other hand. WIG is a pioneer of the infrastructure as a service model in Europe, with a portfolio of over 2,200 wireless infrastructure assets across the UK, together with growing investments in the Netherlands, Ireland, Spain, and the USA. We don't just invest as part of a financial transaction, we're very active managers of wireless infrastructure, investing in them, upgrading them, and marketing them. In the UK, we provide network access to all 4 of the mobile network operators, the MNOs, and over 120 other wireless networks. And we're looking to strategic deals to scale up our network in the UK. In high footfall venues, WIG deploys infrastructure as a service, enabling mobile coverage in iconic venues that have over 1.5 billion visitors each year. The venues that we cover will include well-known places such as Anfield Football Stadium, the Savoy Hotel, the Leadenhall Building, which is the tallest building in the City of London, Media City UK, together with the large majority of UK shopping malls, and small cells on city streets in Glasgow, London, Aberdeen, and Birmingham. WIG has led the way with a new model in the UK and Europe, and we understood early on the significance of the wholesale connectivity model to keep European enterprise competitive and for citizens to reap the socioeconomic benefits of the enhanced mobile broadband. We're partners with the mobile network operators, the MNOs, not competitors. We share goals, but we have different requirements technically and also from a regulatory perspective. And that's why we founded the European Wireless Infrastructure Association, EWIA. It's a trade association that today has 10 members across 14 countries and represents global investments of over 100 billion euros. Across the world, over 2/3 of wireless infrastructure assets are now held independently. And in the US, it's as high as 90%. Yet back in 2014, there was very little understanding or recognition of the independent model. And today, Europe still lags behind the global trend, with only 1/3 to 1/2 of assets held independently. Back then, regulatory policy was focused on managing the behavior of the retail networks with their vertically integrated network infrastructure. And policy development took very little account of independent wireless infrastructure and the very different incentives that we have to share that infrastructure. When our CEO, Scott Coates, held his first meeting for the EWIA with Neelie Kroes, the Commissioner for the Digital Agenda, back in 2014, this was the main discussion point on the agenda. The independent or neutral host infrastructure model is an efficient business model. It encourages investment. It draws in funds from infrastructure funds that wouldn't invest in retail business models. It delivers greater connectivity, and it delivers that at lower cost. Neutral host infrastructure fosters innovation in network development and creates infrastructure competition for the vertically integrated telecoms operators. Research by EY for the EWIA estimates that with greater outsourcing to independent telcos, the mobile operators could release around 28 billion euros of capital. As a very active manager of infrastructure in this space, we have taken a proactive stance in educating policymakers to embrace this model and to provide a stable and predictable regulatory framework that can unlock the hundreds of billions of euros that infrastructure funds have ready to invest. Looking at where we are now, the story of our sector has been very well received by policymakers, and they've recognised the contribution we make to the digital connectivity agenda. And we're delighted that WIG has played an active role in moving things in the right direction. In the new European Electronic Communications Framework, for example, which has been adopted as part of UK law, we've seen recognition of the merits of our business model in Article 80, which provides a lighter touch regulatory framework for wholesale-only networks. And we've seen new regulations for small cells that lower the hurdles for the deployment of this infrastructure, the infrastructure that would be needed for dense 5G networks in urban areas. We want a more progressive regulatory environment because it's good for our business. It attracts greater investment and unlocks socio-economic benefits through shared infrastructure. Shared infrastructure means greater connectivity delivered at lower cost and with less visual impact on the landscape. Our business model seeks to embrace new opportunities through innovation and investment, and we continue to champion regulatory change that enables to provide better connectivity faster to the mobile operators, but also to commercial landlords, enterprises, and organisations. Closer to home in the UK, the government has recognised in the FTIR, the Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, that infrastructure as a service is a model that can encourage investment and competition in the deployment of wireless infrastructure. We've seen the new Communications Code enacted in legislation, which facilitates easier access to land and street furniture and at lower cost. WIG continues to support its clients by seeking to have close and influential relationships with policymakers, regulators, and local authorities, tackling hurdles to infrastructure investment, which range from the need for legislative change, increases in permitted development rights, to tackling the punitive effect of business rates. At a local authority level, the work we did with Aberdeen City Council to deploy the UK's first centralised, or CRAN, which is pictured on the left of this slide, has been held up by the National Infrastructure Commission as a model of the best practice that can be seen in engagement between local authority and infrastructure operator, and the benefit from that relationship in delivering enhanced connectivity and technical innovation. More work is needed to bring Europe up to the levels of independent infrastructure that is experienced across the rest of the world. And we've set out here 5 key priorities to reap the benefits of the independent model. Fundamental to this is to create a better understanding amongst all policymakers of the value of the neutral operators in delivering infrastructure as a service model, and to see this translated into policy interventions. In the UK, for example, we've got a very ambitious programme to extend rural coverage called the Shared Rural Network. And we'd like to see programmes like this designed to embrace independent operators from the outset, working shoulder to shoulder alongside the mobile operators to improve connectivity. And regulatory policy needs to translate to real improvements in removing hurdles in deployment at a local authority level, where we still face challenges, whether those are gaining access to street assets at lower cost, obtaining permits on a timely basis for traffic management to install our equipment, or punitive business rates on our networks. Regulation needs to be agile and responsive to the digital transformation of businesses, property owners, industry, and key sectors like transport and utilities. And we need that match with a spectrum policy that supports private networks, not just lower power in the innovation band. We need a shift from this sandpit development mentality to the high power contiguous bandwidth needed to support industrialized, robust and resilient networks. Many thanks for listening, and I hope that you've benefited from the seminar. If you'd like to download our slides, please visit the Wireless Infrastructure Group. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Van Blois. I'm a senior attorney at Crown Castle, one of the nation's largest providers of shared infrastructure. And I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about some of the regulatory framework for small cells in the United States that helps deployment. So my presentation today is going to focus on 4 of the best practices that we see in terms of small cell regulation here in the US that we've found to be very beneficial to deployment for small cells. The first is maximizing the use of shared infrastructure. That's what we call co-location. The second that I'll talk about is setting timelines for application review. The third is limiting excessive permitting fees. And finally, we'll discuss promoting efficient use of deployment resources. So first, a little background on the US wireless policy. So the 1996 Telecommunications Act preserved local zoning review of wireless facilities with some parameters that were set by federal statute and delegated to the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. So that it allowed local jurisdictions certain parameters over wireless facility siting. Of course, in 1996, we were talking about towers, and now today, a lot of the siting that's taking place is co-locations on existing towers and small cell installations in the right of way. So that preservation of local zoning review, we have 39,000 jurisdictions in the United States. It leads to a patchwork quilt of regulation where regulations for siting small wireless facilities can vary greatly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, even within the same street. So the federal jurisdiction, they retain jurisdiction over environmental and historic resources, the effects of small cells on the environment and historic sites. States and local jurisdictions have a lot of leeway over permitting. However, there are certain limitations where the federal law is a backstop, or the federal government has preempted the field in terms of certain areas, and that does leave an opening for states to curtail local control as long as it does not conflict with the federal principles and the federal statutes and regulations. So, one of the things we'll talk about in terms of those 4 best practices I mentioned, we support enhanced funding for those jurisdictions that have enacted those broadband or 5G ready policies. If they've limited fees and promoted co-location and provided for one-touch make ready and shot clocks. There's the concept in the United States where they could receive additional funding for that because they are sort of a broadband ready jurisdiction. And that's a motivator for them to adopt those policies. So I also want to talk a little bit about state small cell legislation. So there is federal law, there are parameters, it's sort of a backstop in terms of where local review is preempted and where it's permitted. However, more than half of the jurisdictions in the US, about 33 states and Puerto Rico, have adopted a state small cell framework that goes farther than the FCC. So we'll talk a little bit about the fee provisions that the FCC discussed in 2018. It's possible that the state could set fee caps that were lower than the FCC's presumptively reasonable limits, or timelines for local review of siting applications that's shorter. So that's one way that there's a cooperative federalism between the federal government and the state government. And the states, of course, can preempt local jurisdictions within their state in terms of siting. So just a little bit of the framework for what we have here in the US. So the first concept I wanted to talk about was promoting the use of shared infrastructure. This is the concept that when you build a wireless tower or you place a small cell on a utility pole in the right of way, the second antenna on the tower or the second carrier that's added to that small cell facility on the utility pole should be permitted by right. And it's encouraged as a policy here in the US because it reduces barriers to entry for facilities-based competition between various wireless providers. And it promotes the highest and best use of that infrastructure that's already been constructed. The tower that's already been built and permitted, and the jurisdiction's decided that this is where the tower is going to go. Providing an additional antenna array on that tower, it reduces that visual impact to the jurisdiction, and it promotes the existing use of that infrastructure. So there was a law passed that you'll sometimes hear referred to as Section 6409A. That was passed in 2012 when we were going through the 4G LTE upgrade era, and it permitted, it preempted local zoning in terms of co-locating antennas so long as the change to the tower did not substantially change the physical dimensions of the tower. So the FCC sort of interpreted what substantial change means. We won't get into that today, but if you're adding an antenna site, an additional antenna to an already permitted tower, that's permitted by right. And it has to be processed within a certain amount of time. And if it's not processed within that amount of time, it's deemed granted or deemed approved. So this was really helpful during the 4G era, and it's something that we'll continue to see benefits of as we roll out 5G infrastructure on these towers. And it's not just for towers, it also applies to small cells. It's any existing tower or base station. So basically a structure that has a wireless facility already. So some of the implications of this co-location by right policy, it's a clear nationwide policy. You have less of the sort of patchwork quilt of regulation in terms of when you can upgrade an antenna site. It maximizes the use of existing wireless infrastructure while requiring any new structure to go through that typical permitting review that you see. And it encourages efficiency in upgrading those wireless technologies. So the second concept I wanted to talk about is timelines. Providing a set timeline for a local jurisdiction to review an application is really beneficial because it allows the provider to have certainty that within a certain amount of time, you'll know whether or not that facility application is approved or not. So federal statute says it has to be approved within a reasonable period of time. Now, the FCC has interpreted what a reasonable period of time is, and it depends slightly on the type of application, but generally it's between 2 and 3 months for a small cell and about 150 days for a new tower. So that's the framework in terms of the timelines. It provides certainties for both parties in terms of those siting applications. Now, one thing that we don't see as a coherent national policy, except for co-location by right, is that if you submit an application and you don't hear back from the jurisdiction at all, you don't have a remedy beyond going to court. And so certain applications, if a state has passed a law that says there's a deemed granted remedy, or in the case of those co-location by right, Section 6409 type applications, there's a deemed granted remedy. And that means that if the jurisdiction sits on their hands and does nothing with the application, it provides that motivation for them to make a decision, because if they do nothing, it's automatically approved by operation of law. So it's both a remedy and it's a motivator to have the jurisdiction review the application within that time frame and make an up or down decision. So the third concept I wanted to talk about is limiting excessive fees. So this is a big deal for us as we continue to roll out deployment. We're seeing very high fees, both for small cell installations by jurisdictions. Jurisdictions are charging very high fees for small cells, as well as fiber, which is crucial to deploying 5G installations or distributed antenna systems, because that fiber in the right of way is crucial to having the backhaul that's necessary for to operate a small cell network. So over the years, the FCC and courts here in the US have found that state and local fees have the potential to unlawfully prohibit the provision of wireless service, which is contrary to federal law. But most recently in 2018, the FCC said that a jurisdiction had to show that its fees were based on costs. So they had to be either actual costs or a reasonable approximation of actual costs, and that the costs that they're passing on have to be themselves reasonable and non-discriminatory, meaning that you can't pass on an unreasonable cost, even if it is the jurisdiction's actual cost. It has to be objectively reasonable, and you have to treat providers of similar situations the same, so that there's no discrimination. And the FCC also put out fees. It's about $500 in application fees for up to 5 small cells, and up to $100 for each small cell beyond 5, or $1,000 if you're putting in a new pole for a small cell. And then recurring fees, meaning the fees that are charged on a recurring basis, the presumptively reasonable fee is $270. So those are safe harbor. They're presumed reasonable. A jurisdiction could show to the FCC, if challenged, that a higher fee is necessary based on their circumstances. But if a jurisdiction has fees that are within those levels, it knows that they're reasonable. Now, like I said, some states have gone farther and said, no, 270 is a hard cap for recurring fees. And that provides some additional regulatory certainty for us, but that's not the national policy. That can vary slightly from state to state. But this is a crucial step in making sure that we're getting these facilities deployed in a cost-effective manner. So my final point that I want to bring up today is promoting efficient use of deployment resources. So 3 concepts: one touch make ready, which you may hear referred to as OTMR, dig once, and harmonizing power delivery. So this is all about making sure that when there are as few truck rolls, as we call them, or visits to the site to prepare the infrastructure for installation of the new small cell or fiber facility. This avoids that sort of redundancy. So in the case of one touch make ready or climb once, right, it ensures that a certified construction crew is allowed to make all of the necessary changes to that utility pole to prepare it for the new attachments. So that's speeding and reducing the cost of broadband deployment by allowing that new attacher, who has the strongest incentive to make sure that that work is done quickly and efficiently, prepare the pole by doing all the work itself, rather than having each attacher on the pole move its own facilities, and that can take time. This is just one truck roll. And for states that follow the FCC's rules for pole attachments, this was enacted in 2018 as a national policy. Some states don't follow the FCC, so it's up to that state then to decide what to do with OTMR, and it's about half and half in the US between states following the FCC's policy and states that don't. And then dig once. So dig once is one of the largest cost drivers for installing broadband, especially fiber, is that burying the fiber optic cables and conduit. And so it's so important to, when you are coordinating that construction, so let's say a road is being repaved or a new highway is being built, that there's an opportunity there for broadband providers to install conduit, or the jurisdiction install conduit, so that broadband providers can come along and it's less disruptive, and it's sort of one dig, right? Dig once, so that it coordinates that excavation in areas where the right-of-way is being paved or developed, and it helps reduce deployment time by reducing those duplicative federal reviews and permitting for work that's all being done at the same location. This is not necessarily a national policy right now in the US. There's a variety of executive orders that govern various agencies that have enacted this policy, like the Federal Highway Administration. There have been some legislative proposals in the US, but there's not been a sort of one national policy on dig once, but a lot of states have adopted it as well. It makes a lot of sense in terms of that efficient use of deployment resources, right? The final thing I want to talk about is synchronizing power delivery timelines. for small cells. So having the power delivery and make ready proceed at once rather than in a series, and that will also reduce the amount of time. This is not currently enacted in the US, but it's something that we're working with utilities on an individual basis to help them harmonize those policies. And I'll get into this just a little more on the next slide. So you have make ready for poles that are where a small cell is going to be attached. You submit an application, you have, there's a survey that's done, an estimate is provided to tell you how much make ready is necessary on that given pole, and then the make ready itself is completed. And then once the make ready is completed, you can install the small cell. And then there's an inspection period there. But even after the small cell is installed, there can still be a very long delay of several months or more before the small cell is powered up because there's no power. So in the current environment, once the small cell is built, the make ready is all done, nothing is connected. You have to submit an application for power delivery. And then you have a field walk, you design how the electric utility is going to deliver power to that particular small cell, and then you have the power delivered. So what we've proposed is to have the attachment application and the power application proceed at the same time so that you can have these processes work in tandem, proceed at the same time, and it brings the facilities on air much faster. And so that's something that we're currently working on, and it's crucial to speeding small cell power delivery. So that's my presentation today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about some of these high-level concepts that we have in the US in terms of small cell regulation. And thank you so much for your time today.
Hi, good day, everyone. I'm Firdaus Fadzil, Group Head of Regulatory Affairs from E.co, dialing in from Kuala Lumpur. It is my pleasure to be here today with other distinguished speakers and industry thought leaders to discuss the growth of the neutral host, emerging business models, the diversity of the regulatory frameworks, and emerging global best practices. A bit of introductions of E.co. We are one of the largest independent infrastructure service provider, having presence in 8 markets across South Asia and Southeast Asia. 2022 will be a defining year for E.co, as we are actively seeking opportunity to grow into active infrastructure business, beyond passive infrastructure, as well as to grow inorganically via M&A or expansion into new geographical markets. So today, I would like to take this opportunity to share some insights and learnings with the audience drawn from the experience operating in our emerging markets. So let's get started. First of all, it's on the regulatory landscape. Common across Asia and perhaps in Africa, the neutral host business model is heavily regulated in our markets. Licensing models are quite diverse and ranges from 3 types of models. Number 1 is tower-specific licenses or certificates, like what we have in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Cambodia, Philippines, and Laos. Secondly is on the network facility licenses, which arguably allows a broader scope of business, like what we have in Malaysia, as well as Myanmar. And last but not least is a generic authorizations, however, with a very limited scope of business, like what we have in Sri Lanka, which only allows us to operate shareable poles infrastructures. The diversity of the model contrasts with the framework found in North America, EU, Australia, UK, where only a registration or general authorizations are required. Our American counterparts, for instance, operate as a real estate investment trustee rather than a telecom licensee. And therefore, that gives them a lot of advantage compared to companies like E.co. And I'll explain in greater details later. As a telecom licensee, our operations are required to pay license fees. Most of the license fees are in the form of revenue sharing. In our key markets, we are contributing about 6.5 to 7% of the revenues to the regulators. And this excludes certainly the contribution in the form of levies, as well as tax on profits and consumption taxes to the tax authorities. Rigid licensing framework to some extent inhibits TowerCos from accelerating into active infrastructure business. In other parts of the world, the simplified licensing frameworks allows them to basically enables distributed antenna services, small cell services, edge computing services, transmission services together and bundle that together into a single offerings quite seamlessly. Whereas in our markets, if we were to do that, certainly it would require amendment to the regulation, amendment to the license, or perhaps, and to a large extent, amendments to the license conditions. And these lengthy regulatory processes is the one that could hamper TowerCos or infrastructure co's ability to infuse innovations into the offerings at the speed, at scale that we wanted. As far as permit is concerned, all type of structures requires permits from the local authorities, whereas in the developed markets, steps are already being taken to simplify permitting process by exempting low impact facilities from permits requirements. And that's very exciting for us in emerging markets to learn. Secondly, is on the policy development. COVID-19 reinforces the urgency to deliver reliable and resilient connectivity to all, and to ensure accessibility of live enhancing services over digital platform. The government, from my perspective, for the past 1.5 years, have taken bold steps in addressing the connectivity inequality. To name a few, I'll share some examples from our emerging markets. Number one is Malaysia. Malaysia, via initiatives of Jendela as well as MyDigital, have introduced a multi-pronged strategy in terms of in addressing network inequality. We have a structured initiative and strategies to push for 96.9% LTE coverage at 35 megabit per second speed by end of 2022. On top of that, the regulator is strongly committed to switch off 3G and refarm the access spectrum for 4G LTE services by end of this year. Last but not least, the government is also committed to launch 5G services by year end and has come up with a network KPI of minimum 100 Mbps per second SLH. And on top of that, try to fast track the deployment of 5G in Malaysia at the 80% population coverage by 2024. Second example is perhaps Philippines. Philippines has taken very bold step in terms of enacting a new law altogether by coming out with a Bayani Hand to Recover as One Act 2020. Following this enactment, a stronger mandate has been given to Anti-Relative Authority to come up with various joint memorandum circular or JMC to streamline and simplify tower construction and build permit processes. On top of that, there are already a public consultation being initiated by ARTA to streamline shareable poles and ROW processes. And on top of that, last but not least, the DICT, the sector regulator, are also looking at reviewing their National Broadband Plan 2017-2027. And this is because the National Broadband Plan itself envisaged the development and construction of close to 60,000 cell sites by 2024 with broadband speed of 20 Mbps. Philippine cell sites currently stands at 23,000 sites only. So it's a very ambitious target. Yeah. Last but not least is perhaps some example drawn from Sri Lanka. The regulator has basically launched a project GS, which entails 100% 4G coverage targets by end of 2022. And these targets will be achieved by effective utilizations of telecom development levy fund. On top of that, TRC as a sector regulator has also launched and closed public consultation on the review of the licensing framework, in which EDOTCO has participated as well. So we remain hopeful that TRC will consider our proposal to look at migrations of new licensing framework a la Malaysia, a la Singapore, a la Thailand, which allows independent tower companies to basically provide services in Sri Lanka. Regardless of certain suboptimal conditions in the market, there are some emerging best practices coming out from the markets where we operate. So we have 5 of them. As I reflect the regulatory development for the past 1.5 years, I'm actually excited to see some changes brought forward through the followings. Number one is the adoption of a whole of government approach, WGA, in some of the markets, either directly or indirectly. One of the examples is perhaps Malaysia and Philippines, where a coordinated and collaborative efforts has been actually put in place by multiple ministries and government agencies as well as local authorities to find common solutions in addressing telcos problems as well as infrastructure core problems. Number two is perhaps the fact that more focus being given to streamline permitting approval processes. And this is perhaps because all of head of the governments are showing strong interest in pushing for connectivity agenda. Therefore, more attention being given to address operations challenges such as build permits and ROW. And on top of that, there are already an attempt in Philippines and Cambodia to issue a service level agreements for LGUs or local government units to comply with. This is something that has been implemented in Philippines via the issuance of the fresh joint memorandum circular. And we know for the fact that Cambodia is also looking at this via the introduction of the forthcoming sub-decree on infrastructure sharing. The third emerging best practice is perhaps on the attempt to actually reduce permitting fees to a normal level. And this entails a stronger engagement between regulators at the federal level, as well as the engagement with the state level who has the autonomy over the setting of the permitting fees. Yeah. And one of the examples is perhaps in Malaysia, where a regulator has done a lot of roadshows engaging with a lot of local government authorities as well as the state governments to adjust annual as well as one-off permitting fees closer to the mean. Yeah. Number four is the adoption of the broadband as a third utility as a policy objective and policy intent. And we have seen this implemented in Malaysia, and consequently, the local authorities and state governments are now assigning zones for telecom infrastructure in their development plans. On top of that, we have seen special rates being introduced for the access to the electricity grid under the pretext of essential services. We are also excited to learn that government of Pakistan are also looking at adopting broadband as a third utility beside electricity as well as water into their national broadband plan. So we are very excited to have a constant dialogue with ministry in Pakistan as well as PTA on how to shape this further. Last but not least is, of course, the ongoing reforms to the USO fund, as what we have seen in Malaysia as well as in Cambodia. In Malaysia, the MCMC has taken a very good effort in terms of mandating a 2G as well as 4G mandatory MOCAN sharing in their USP projects. On top of that, MCMC has also allocated a reserve tender for the infrastructure cost to participate to allow a more equitable disbursement of the USP fund to all the licensees who contributed into this fund. In Cambodia, another way to basically make sure that the telecom fund or USO fund being used effectively, the TRC has also allowed 50% of the claim to be made for the contribution that the licenses have made into this fund. And this has been implemented for a while now. The government ambitious connectivity goals provided opportunities for neutral hosts to be at the forefront of infrastructure investment in connecting the underconnected as well as unconnected segment of society. A neutral host such as E.co is well positioned to undertake investment in micro, macro, small cells, fiber transmission, and energy management. Consolidation of these network elements under neutral hosts will enable MNOs to extend their services faster at record speed. The aggressive connectivity targets cannot be delivered by the MNO alone, not when most of the MNOs, except number one, typically, has a ROIC less than their WACC. Therefore, it will require the government to permit infrastructure costs to experiment with emerging innovation, such as Open RAN, edge computing, and some others, which could potentially give birth to other emerging business models. For instance, network as a service at rural areas. So in this context, I believe a regulatory sandbox that grants some form of relaxations to current restrictions, for instance, spectrum sharing, spectrum pooling to be managed by the infrastructure companies or neutral hosts, antenna ownership for the neutral hosts, provision of lead fiber and whatnot should be explored under the pretext of introductions of regulatory sandbox framework. With 5G CapEx supercycle and government connectivity agenda. Future is promising for neutral hosts, despite some limitations in the regulatory landscape we are operating in. With regulators open to embrace innovation and undertaking further reforms, I believe we can collectively build a solid case to demonstrate a value of neutral hosts in bringing in new form of investment, i.e. foreign direct investment, facilitate more efficient wholesale market, and driving service-based competition at the retail level, all for the benefits of the end user. Thank you.
Good day. My name is Amit Sharma. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Digital Infrastructure Providers Association in India. Our members have over 650,000 towers and over 2.2 million base stations that we operate on behalf of our customer. Today, I'll be talking to you about the regulatory climate for digital infrastructure neutral host providers. That's a long name, so I will use TARCO as a shorthand to talk about tower companies, small cells, providers of small cells, optic, fiber, DAS, edge data, etc. 2021 proved beyond doubt that mobile telephony is a lifeline for citizens, particularly during a time of crisis. Many governments elevated the telecom sector and the tower sector to the level of an essential service and gave it additional security and support to enable rollout during the COVID crisis and keep up connectivity. Governments, operators, and TARCOs worked together in an unprecedented manner to deliver communication services to the citizens. And this was an essential requirement because people who were stuck at home needed this lifeline to give them information on COVID relief activities, permit them to work from home if they did not have a fixed broadband, allow kids to go to school and college online, and many more such utilities. So once and for all, we established ourselves as an essential service. There were numerous positive developments in our sector as regulators took note of the importance of the sector and put in place enabling regulations to make ease of rollout, to permit ease of rollout and deployment of network services. In India, the government set up the National Broadband Mission, which has a very ambitious goal of taking fiber to every one of India's 650,000 villages. In addition, the government has asked us in the telecom and tower sector to roll out another 1 million towers, more than doubling the tower network of the country. And what's more, they want us to fiberize 70% of these towers compared to 30% today. Because without this, they recognize 5G, the true benefits of 5G and IoT will not happen. In order to make this possible, the government has set up state-level committees of government servants, operators, and TARCOs to deal with problems as they occur to speed up deployment and rollout. The telecom regulator, TRAI, for its part, has weighed in and suggested to the government, suggested strongly, that the current limitation on TARCOs that they only do passive infrastructure, that this limitation be removed and TARCOs be permitted to do anything that a licensed customer, an operator or an internet provider requires from them. There were many positive developments in other countries too. In the Philippines, the Department of DICT, Department of Information and Communication Technology, teamed up with the Anti-Red Tape Authority and issued a joint circular that cuts through the multi-layered approval process for siting of towers and reduces the timeline from a year plus to 2 months. This is a radical departure from the past because Philippines, with over 6,000 subscribers per tower, needs more towers to improve its network. The results are already becoming visible. Line speeds have improved as a result of this policy, and of course, the opening up of national highways for deployment of towers. In Bangladesh, many of you are aware that BTRC, the regulator, had already permitted 4 neutral host TowerCos to come into operation. And concurrent with this, the BTRC had directed that operators who own towers either spin these off or keep them only for captive use. BTRC is now also looking at whether there's significant market player policy, which applies to operators who have more than 40% share and puts some limitations on the way they price and offer and provide incremental market share or gain incremental market share, whether or not this policy can be and should be extended to TowerCos. In Indonesia, we saw again a very major change in the regulations. The tower sector, where FDI had been prohibited by placing it on the negative list, was opened up, and now 100% FDI is permitted in the tower sector. This has led to a spate of deals and over a couple of $2 billion of FDI just in a few months. What's more important is it has spurred revival of growth in the tower sector and deployment, particularly outside Java, which is where the connectivity is the weakest. So these are really good developments, and hopefully regulators in this room will take note of these and look at their applicability in their own countries. But this is the glass half full. There are some things that still need to be done. I will touch on 3 of these. The first is in many countries, there still is a debate on whether TowerCos should be licensed or just registered with a competent authority. Pretty much across the world, led by the FCC, the regulators are taking the view that it is sufficient to register a TowerCo for many reasons. We are digital infrastructure providers. We are investors in infrastructure. We are not service providers. We don't deliver services to the consumer. There's no need for complex, cumbersome, expensive licensing. Further, given the amount of FDI and investment we bring, the less restrictions there are on our sector, the more investment there will be and the more rapid the growth of the sector. And last but not least, the neutral host model is the most efficient model for building networks because it provides for sharing. This reduces both CapEx and OpEx, allows lower costs, and which ultimately get passed on to the consumer. The second area where I would urge those in this room, and particularly the regulators, to think about is that 5G and Internet of Things will require an order of magnitude growth in the network, in the number of nodes that the network has, in the number of radios and antenna that are deployed. We need to be able to put radios and antenna on the sides of buildings, on bus stops, on on electricity poles, on government buildings. But the policies for this do not exist today in most countries. It is essential that these are put in place because without this, 5G will be hampered and IoT is more or less not going to happen unless these enabling policies and practices are there. Last but not least, in pretty much every country, the cost for siting of towers and the rights of way for laying of optic fiber, these are usually, the charges are exorbitant. In most countries, there is no national regulation of these, and therefore the TowerCo is left to deal with a multiplicity of local authorities, each of whom is looking to extract the maximum rental fees or charges they can. This is not just an unnecessary burden on the overall network cost, but it slows down the deployment considerably because inevitably there are disputes. The disputes take a long time to resolve. I would urge the regulators at the national level to lay down national guidelines for how cost-based charges should be implemented, and then have the governments implement a mechanism where this is where the local bodies do not deviate from these policies. Now, local bodies will lose some revenue, which needs to be made up from the center, but the gain in terms of growth of the telecom network, growth of coverage, connectivity, inevitably impacts GDP and government revenue. So this is a very important, much needed step. With that, let me close. 2021 was a challenging year, but TowerCos working together with their customers and the governments met these challenges. But we have new mountains to climb, and let's work together to scale those too. Thank you.